So I've got the pleasure of kicking off with some of the questions for this panel. But so you can prepare some of your questions that if you want to ask any of the members of the panel around the theme of rethinking cybersecurity. So I'm going to just send a pointed question through to Andrew. I was fortunate enough to understand the rationale and the findings around the research. It told a very unique story about the New Zealand context, which we haven't had for a while. But based on the findings that came out of that and some of the things that you shared with us, but I know there's a lot of other things you didn't share with us because of time, what would you suggest needs to be part of a rethink of how we implement security in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how should we be considering the role of identity in our plans?
Yeah. Okay. Wow. You asked a question there about describing the universe. I think you've just done that again. Thank you for that curly one. There is, to me, and Georgia just touched on it, communication and collaboration are two key aspects to doing what we do better. So the communication is making sure, as you talked about as well, Paul, that our language is clear and consistent. And in my belief, that is both inside the tent, if you like, the language used amongst each other, but that should be consistent with the language we're talking with the general public about, and with organisations and stakeholders within our own organisations too. Otherwise, we get these disconnects happening all the time, and the special language, and it just increases that isolation, really, of these, and this picture of these specialists who can only communicate amongst themselves, and that's the opposite of what this industry needs to be. Collaboration is incredibly important in this as well, and as a number of the speakers today have touched on collaboration within organisations, so making sure that the risk and the security components and the IT components are aligned with product and aligned with marketing and all those sort of things. I want to touch on as well, and I think this is uniquely Aotearoa, the way in which other jurisdictions have implemented digital identity solutions tends to have been centralised. Even if they're using a decentralised solution, it comes by mandate. Somewhere like Singapore is a good example of that, where everyone is told this is the framework you're going to use, and then you're free to sort of develop with that and API structures and standards and all those sort of things. So while it's an enabling system, it's actually it's led and in a certain manner enforced by a government which is used to people complying with what they say. New Zealand isn't quite like that. And in fact, we're one of the few jurisdictions, there's a few, Australia and Britain in particular are examples where we don't have a national ID, we don't have a cornerstone national ID which we hook everything off. In my mind, that's actually a really good thing, because there are so many different aspects to our identity. We don't necessarily need the government to tell us who we are. We actually know who we are. And if we've got methods and means of asserting that identity and trusting each other, which is where the ecosystem is so important, then we can unlock a whole lot of benefit. One of the things I didn't mention in my talk is the work that the Digital Identity Transition Program is doing within the DIA. They're working on a trust framework bill, and the idea there is to create a level of standardisation. It's not really standardisation. It's giving organisations the opportunity to be certified to share information with each other, to be trusted parties in an identity ecosystem. In very simple terms, opening up real media competition. Now that's a good thing because it unlocks a whole lot of benefit, it unleashes innovators, but it also causes us to rethink how we design our information flows. So instead of passing mass files of personalised data all over the place, we can actually start passing tags, verified information, credentials, those sort of things, minimise our data footprint while we're maximising the benefit to consumers and organisations themselves. So collaboration in that sense is not just within individual organisations, it's across industries and sectors. To me, that's really key.
And I'm going to touch on some of those things later. I was going to go to Ashton, Cayford, your role is one that interests me. Can you give us any horse racing tips? Because you work for Horse Racing New Zealand. So you can meet him out afterwards and get some tips from him. But, I mean, how has your industry changed in its view of security?
I think it's probably not a good story to share, but you know we did have a security event a few years ago. So while that wasn't a good outcome, it was a good thing to raise the awareness of security within the organisation. I think one of the things we struggle with is technology, working in technology, being technologists. So we understand technology quite well, but trying to get the organisation or the business to understand that is actually really difficult. Yeah. And what we see here today is that we're creating all these new acronyms every 2 years, and that's just going to make our life even harder. I think the key there is to try and make security simple for people. I know it's not simple. I know it's terribly complex, but for our customers and for the general public, making it simple would actually make our lives easier. I think one of the easiest examples I can give for that is often I talk to the chief executive and I'm trying to get extra money or resources for technology to work on projects. But if I talk to him and I see his eyes are glazing over, then I know I'm not going to get the money. And I know why that's happening is because I'm talking like a technologist. I'm talking using acronyms and terms that we all understand, but people outside this room don't. So I think the second part, so we've got to make it simple, we've also got to make it more relatable to the customers. And I think that's something that Gavin touched on before, that if we can explain the risk or the outcome in a business term rather than a technology term, that'll be the key to help in the future as well.
Great, thanks, Austin. And I've got a follow-up for you, but I'm going to go over to Micah. See, she's looking at me with like that aggression in her face. I'm concerned. Micah, you're the security and the privacy officer at Optimal Workshop. When you started in this role, were there any fundamental principles that you had to rethink in the way that you approached the role? And specifically, with this apparent conflict between security and privacy?
Right. A lot of love for you, Paul, obviously. No hate.
That's being recorded, so everyone knows that, no?
Yeah. So, I mean, I had to rethink everything, but at the same time, I had to go back to the foundational principles of what are the security principles that we learn, like right from the basics, information, technology, people. And for me, I didn't want to come in there and be like, hey, product team, you need to do this, or we need to do this from a governance perspective, or we have all these things and stuff like that. But you need to take a step back and say, okay, let's take this from a risk point of view. And I mean, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it is all about raising those risks and explaining the why to people, not just management. Often, I mean, I've been in big organizations where often the risks are only raised up. We need to raise the risk across. We need to sit down with I've been in a project where I sit down with the solutions architects and the developers and say, look, man-in-the-middle attack. How do you do that in a serverless environment, in a single-page application with no authentication? How do you secure that? So it's coming into a meeting and realizing I'm probably not going to be the smartest person in the room. And there's obvious biases when I walk in. And it's just sitting there and be like, look, this is the risk. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to tell you what the specific security requirements are and how you're going to implement it. I want you to understand the risk, and let's work together in coming up with a solution. And they're all bright people. Like, I know nothing about specific programming languages and stuff like that, but I rely on them to do their job, and for us to just really collaborate in coming up with the solutions. And you end up with a culture where just security becomes inherently built in within the process. When there's a new project, they're like, it's not even formalized. And since the 18 months that I've been at Optimal, people will be like, hey, loop Micah in. And sometimes I'm kind of like, do I have to be in this meeting? Like, you guys know what's up. But it's that culture that I wanted to bring in. I wanted them to understand the whys of why we do security. It's not just, they hired me because of GDPR. 65% of we're a weird tech company that has 65% of our market share in the US, 25% in the EU. GDPR came into play last year. CCPA came into California Consumer Privacy Act came into play. So there were a lot of more privacy liabilities for them, and they were very reactive about that. But for me, it was more, okay, besides that, what is it that we're trying to protect? What is it that is important about our customers' information that they're basically handing us the key to look after? And once they understand that, then it's easier to actually get traction on a lot of the processes in a lot of the projects.
Back to this conflict between security and privacy and how those two parts of your brain work. But we're going to go over to Ashton Jones. So Ashton, you've been hosting a number of industry-specific roundtables over the last couple of years, where you sit with the CISOs and you talk through some of the issues they're experiencing. What issues have been raised there on those roundtables that have provided the need for us to sit and actually rethink the way we do security?
Sure. So the roundtables, they're actually not industry specific, they are cross-industry. And I think the biggest value that the attendees to these roundtables get is because they're getting these perspectives from all of these different industries. So often each of our customers, our CISOs, CIOs, they're operating their own little bubble. Their little bubble may extend to their industry bubble, which might be finance, banking, government, etc. But those bubbles in themselves don't have the same perspective if you all join together and start having those conversations. And that's what those roundtables kind of brings together, is that whole collaboration. We've been talking about collaboration a lot today. It's a recurring theme. And it's important across industries as well, because you may learn something completely different from an energy perspective or from a government perspective in terms of how they're communicating upwards and downwards to their boards. And I think those roundtables are really important. It's Chatham House rules. People can come together, they can communicate and know that it's not going to leave the room. And we get a lot of good stuff out of there, and there's a lot of different themes that we kind of cover off. From the latest one we did was actually a little while ago, supply chain security, and talking about the fact that actually supply chain security, whilst the number of attacks that come through supply chain are small in comparison to the likes of phishing, scams, etc., supply chain security, the actual impact of those attacks has been a lot larger. So that's where we've been seeing, major data loss events, major compromise of organisational integrity and reputation. So it's just good to be able to get together and talk about the issues that everybody here faces and how each different industry is addressing those differently.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Anyone has a particular question they want to ask our panelists? Because I've got a couple that I've got lined up. So, Andrew, I'm going to throw a grenade your way.
Bring it on.
The role of accessibility and digital inclusion in what we do and our approach to that.
Yep.
In a services industry, in whatever industry it may be, what do we need to do around that?
Yeah, it's a challenge we need to remind ourselves of all the time. I once heard not that long ago, I think it was a CIO of a large government department, so they aim for 80%. And I'm sitting there uncomfortably thinking, hell, that's not good enough. 80% is nowhere near good enough. In Digital Identity New Zealand, we have an awesome relationship with an international group that's called Women in Identity, and they were formed around bringing a diversity of views and talent to the table when it comes to talking about identity, and that's obviously it's the name implies the gender diversity, but its mandate goes beyond that. And they've got an awesome motto, really like it. You actually reflect some of the same values within SSS, which is great as well. And their motto is, identity solutions built for everybody are built by everybody. Which is beautiful in its self-containment, if you like. It's not just a matter of thinking about who's affected. It's actually bringing the people who are impacted and users, as service users or customers, whatever you want to call the people who use your systems, bringing them to the table and bringing perspectives to the table. So that relates to ethnicity, it relates to gender, it relates to neurodiversity, it relates to accessibility challenges, especially if we're talking digital. So all of those factors are incredibly important. And this is, again, where collaboration comes to the fore, because if we find innovative solutions and we find where those pockets of expertise are, where we can truly be good for everybody, then we can solve the problem for everybody. And it's an area where I think in New Zealand we've got the opportunity to be a world leader in that. And there's probably a particular nuance of that, and again, the threads have been woven through today, is recognition of te tiriti, recognition of the role of tangata whenua of Māori. And that's not just saying we need to make sure Māori aren't left behind. It's not that discussion. It's actually what can a te ao Māori worldview teach us about the systems and the roles that we play. And from an identity perspective, that's huge. You think about the concept of whakapapa. It's something that as a Caucasian, as a Pākehā, it's not something it's not a concept that I'm brought up with. We're in this sort of nuclear family, and that's it. But the concept of whakapapa, when you're tracing your lineage back through both maternal and paternal, through your iwi, your hapu, it's incredibly powerful when we're talking about collaboration and trust, to the point where if you talk about those cornerstones of establishing identity, one of the keys to unlocking that is actually working with hapu and iwi. Because we don't need government to come in and say, I'm going to tell you who you are. Who's best to say who you are? It's actually your family. And if you can recite 6 levels of your whakapapa, then, mate, that's good enough for me.
I mean, and just I think from an invitational perspective, if there's, when we are grappling with this idea of how to, build solutions that is accessible and that is diverse enough for everybody, there's an organisation called DINS. I think let's use the kind of expertise that there is. I remember I mentioned in one of our sessions, I was walking through a building and in Auckland, I was meeting with a client, walking through a building, and a whole stream of people came past. And I stopped the one guy and I said to him, what's going on? They said, it's an accessibility test for their emergency drills. And so there were people in wheelchairs, there were people with guide dogs, there were people, all different kinds of, all different diverse people with different handicaps and different accessibility challenges. And they were using that to determine whether or not that emergency drill was going to suit everybody. And so when we're building our solutions and we're building what is going to be for this TX, as we call it now, this total experience, let's not forget that. To be able to, and the group called the Digital Identity NZ that's there, there's different work groups that are established that we can take part in to make sure that our voices are heard and the way in which we address this going forward. So I want to go back to...
I'm wondering, I think...
Oh, sorry. Okay, you got a question.
Champion in this, right?
Yeah, I guess I'll answer. I mean, it really, when we talk about zero trust or high trust, you always think that your staff really doesn't have bad intent. The things that they do, most of them obviously have good intent. And there's a level of establishing the processes, and you can do it for the sake of compliance. Like at the moment, we're working on a SOC 2 attestation, SOC 2 audit, and what level of that are we just doing for the sake of compliance versus what's actually beneficial to the business and what's actually making sense, and trusting that people will actually just do what they've learned. And then we've learned about, we've heard about awareness and education and consistent language. And I think it's breaking it down to an understandable way that they get exactly where you're coming from, the whys, et cetera, like that. But finding the balance that your company, like every organization, will have a different risk appetite. every organization will manage different types of data. And so it's understanding in the context of your organization, where do you meet, where's that middle, where it's comfortable for everyone to have, like if you're a tech company, you probably have a higher level of trust. And it's easier for me to say because it's a company of around 60 people, but in a government agency, where is that level of comfort that you can have, or the management can have, to be able to trust the people to do the right things in some things, and where necessary, actually putting, where it makes sense, security controls and technical controls in place.
Austin, would you be comfortable with, just back to Kay's question about going, well, I'm going to institute wholesale technological controls, and let's use the example that Kay used about not being able to have a whole trail of email addresses below there. Is that something that would sit well with you in terms of a technologically based control that they cannot do it, or based on what Micah was saying, that try and find this balance? Because if we go down the route of what is trust actually, we're going to be here for a couple of days. What would you...
So it's absolutely about finding the right balance. I think we should all keep in mind that we're all human, and so we're all going to make mistakes. We can put in technology controls for Africa, and that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to stop that from happening again. I think there's a good example with that. So you could put a technology control in just to limit the number of, BCCs or other people, but then there may well be a relevant business need to send out an email to 40 people, and then you've just stopped the business from operating, which isn't a good thing. I think one of the things that I've seen work over the last couple of years, particularly relating to email, is the ongoing awareness campaign. So that's like essentially sending fake messages to people and seeing what they do, and then off that building up a training campaign. The key to remember is that these people aren't technologists. They've got their day job, and it's up to us to help them. We need to train them, and so we need to take different approaches. You can send out emails to tell people how to identify a spam. You can give them video training on how to do that, and some of those are effective. But we've still got to keep finding better and simpler ways to help teach our customers, our end users.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. So I think it's a balancing act, right, between people, technology, and process. So there's no, this is more than that, this is more than that. But in terms of what we see in our customers, one area that it's improving, but one area that's underinvested is that training and awareness, so enabling the people. And last year we talked about the human element. That was our theme for last... Well, you're in a bit ago, yeah. For our last Cyber Day event, and we talked a lot about that. And I think that there's still an underinvestment in terms of actually enabling our people to be the frontline responders. They say that hackers aren't hacking anymore; they're logging in, and that's because they're after your users and they're getting the credentials off your users. So
yeah, because the user's the target now.
Yeah. And it's because we've closed everything else down. There's a question at the back. If you can use the mic there.
thank you.
Thanks.
Don't sing.
Paul,
Don't sing.
very tempting. I just wanted to come back to kind of one of the points that you made, Paul, earlier, and just interested on the panel's thoughts. Again, you kind of spoke on that don't talk to the cyber guys because they're going to stop the project. I call it security as a disabler versus security as an enabler. I'm interested in kind of the thoughts from the panel on how we can kind of have that rethinking cybersecurity so that we're improving that engagement with our stakeholders, even the apathetic ones, to be able to, again, be better brakes to help the business, again, even business as usual, much less that digitisation and better use of connectivity and data and similar.
Cool. Austin, we'll start with you and then we'll go to Micah.
Sure. So what I found works there is we've got to break down the barriers, and what Ashton talked about before is collaboration. And people have been talking a lot about collaboration because agile is cool and trendy at the moment, but it's actually going to help us if we can work together with the business. We can be involved, and so you won't get to the position where you're halfway through a project and should we think about security? Because nobody wants to be there. We want to get to the point where the technology, or specifically the security team, are involved right from the beginning, And the only way that you can do that is to break down the barriers and be constructive, not say, no, you can't do this because of the security implications of that, but think of, I understand the security implications, I understand that the business want to achieve this, how can we, come to some common ground, how can we achieve it, how can we achieve part of it? I think that's a good approach.
Micah?
Oh, I totally agree. And I mean, when someone asks, what do you do? I'm kind of like, I'm a professional pessimist. That's what we do in security. And I think that view actually of myself helped me become better at what I do, because when you realize I don't want to be a pessimist, I don't want to be a barrier to projects, I want to help them create secure solutions, then I tend to, it's exactly the same point. You sit there with them, you collaborate, and you have to have a certain level of knowledge about yourself and know that, hey, you know what, I'm not going to know everything. Like, what do you think about this? Or go out and ask other very capable people within the business or outside to see what they think, how we can address a solution. But I think if we're always going to be a bit of a, and I've seen it, unfortunately, in the past, a bit of a, no, you just have to do that, or no, this is the only way. It's like, we're never going to get anywhere, and we're always going to be viewed negatively. But,
One of the things that you find, did it answer your question? Sorry. Yeah. So one of the things that if you look in the, and I'm not a very big motorsport enthusiast. I didn't watch a lot of Formula One racing that goes in circles and things. But one thing that I do know after looking into it is that as they increase the speed and they lower the weight of the car, the next thing they improve is the brakes. And the reason that they do that is to make that car go faster. Counterintuitive, yeah? Because the brakes are actually there to stop the car. But what they do is they improve that to the point that they can get this car to go a lot faster and stop a lot quicker. And so when we often get seen as the brakes or the handbrakes inside of organizations, when we can communicate in a way that says that I'm actually here to make your project succeed. I'm actually here to make it go faster. I'm actually here to make it know and identify things quicker so that we can avoid catastrophic events. That sort of communication and breaking down of barriers from there. I'm going to steal the professional pessimist. When someone asks me what I do, I'm going to say I'm a professional pessimist from there. Did anyone else have any comments around that?
There's an aspect of this too, which is asking the right questions. And if you take some of the privacy by design principles in particular, the things that the Privacy Commissioner will tell you that you should be thinking about, they actually help avoid a whole lot of work. And so if a business unit comes to you and say, I need to share, all of my customer data, 50,000 people's personal information with another organisation, it's like, okay, what are you trying to achieve? I'll give you an example. We had Auckland Transport had a challenge where they had to, I'm not sure if they're still doing it, hopefully they're not still doing this, they had to validate whether a student was a student in order to give them a discount. So they were obliged to give a discount and had to find a mechanism to actually enable that to happen. The only solution they had available to them was to go to each educational institute in Auckland and ask them for a database of all of their students. Now they know that that was an exercise in futility, frustration and risk from day one, but they had no other way to do it. Now, if you are designing a solution for that, the answer to the problem isn't sharing information. In that context, it's not replicating a whole lot of information and giving it to someone else to check. It's utilising a different system of ideally a flag in that case. Can you confirm that this person is a student in your institution? Yes. Great, that's all I need to know. That's my audit trail. No other information is passed. So there's a big thing about asking the right questions and almost minimising scope by virtue of doing that. So you're not overcomplicating your solutions because they can actually be done in a lot more simple fashion.
If I said, Andrew, just on that point, that for us to solve this issue of the binding and the markers and those things, as organizations, we have to stop being selfish. And move into a sharing culture where we only share markers as opposed to sharing all the information. Because we use that information for marketing, for understanding the digital dust and how we're going to go and look at targeted marketing towards our customers, what's the age range, then I've got to give you insurance and all those kind of things. But if we started sharing, then a lot of that would go away. And I think there is something that as DINs that we're going to be showing about showing the marker of over 18, under 18.
Yeah, that's one of the, it's a
just an
classic
example
use
of
case
what-
for digital identity, of proof of ID for buying alcohol. And you don't need, even by showing a driver's license, you're oversharing information. It might have your address on it, all of those sort of things. You don't need it. All the licensee needs to know is that you are who you say you are and you're over 18. That's all. And having an auditable way of doing that to protect them from prosecution is what you need. So a system like verifiable credentials, which is one of the things that's been talked about as a standard, is a way of doing that, so that minimises that footprint.
Actually, I'm interested, so all of these, the roundtables and the discussions that you're having with customers, with CISOs, we're a technology company. And again, using what Andrew said earlier, we're a technology company, we build solutions and we provide solutions. Based on the perspectives that you get from these roundtables, how has that changed the way in which you look for potential solutions to provide to the New Zealand and Australian market?
Sure. So I guess one of the things that's kind of challenging for me personally with today is we're talking about rethinking cybersecurity. And as you mentioned, Paul, we are a cybersecurity provider and we provide tools and solutions, and we've profited from chasing the latest trends. So, we're talking about in the roundtables, what are we going to do for DevSecOps? What are we going to do for X, Y, and Z? And it's kind of like these are ideas for us for our next product ideas. Get on the bandwagon and make that a profitable business exercise for us. So the challenge really is not to follow those, and that's something that has been discussed a lot in the roundtables that I run. Is you get something that happens in the news as another knee-jerk reaction, a DDoS attack, some sort of vulnerability that's been exploited, and all of a sudden you've got your management, the CEO, coming down on you saying, "What are you doing about this? Are we implementing something? Are you going to go and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars implementing, Cloudflare, Akamai, whatever?" And having the conversations in those roundtables to say, well, no, we shouldn't be spending that money because here's the payoff for that. I was having a conversation with one of the gents who's in part of my roundtable today on this. We shouldn't be paying $300,000 for that specifically because it's mitigating a business risk which equates to maybe $50,000 to us, 5 days of website outage maybe. So yes, we do talk about a whole range of different tools and solutions, and it does kind of adjust the way that we as a business, and I take my staff direction as well on this, but how we take the business and what solutions we look at. I think the challenge for me personally now is, well, actually, how do we look at ourselves differently, and how do we rethink what we're delivering from a cybersecurity perspective? And one of the vision components that we have for the next 5 years is actually taking all of the various different areas of expertise that we have and melding them into kind of like a consolidated view of the SSS cybersecurity services that we provide to our clients. So that's something that's always talked about at the roundtables, is how do we get that single pane of glass that speaks upwards and speaks downwards to our teams.
Yeah. And it speaks to what Micah spoke about earlier about raising risks across and looking at that. Are there any other questions? I must just check in every so often, otherwise it's the Paul show. Not that I don't mind, I don't get a chance to speak often. So,
I think just to add on to Ashton's point as well, I always said to my boss, what are your goals for your job essentially? And I was like, I'm here to phase myself off this job. I want to get Optimum Workshop in a state where it's like, even without me, they know exactly the tools that we've purchased. They know exactly the output that they're getting from it. They know who to go to or who's managing it, etc. That I know that the processes have been automated, and a little bit like what Shamu will probably touch on later on, there's not one product that's going to solve it all, and one product doesn't mean you're protected unless there's no one there to actually to get the value out of what you're getting. So not just buying tools like Ashton said and not having knee-jerk reactions to events, but actually what's the value, who's going to manage it, understanding the vendor risk management, and that whole process is a whole nother, realm that I think we all could do a lot better on here in New Zealand.
You touched on that, so I want to ask a question because you've got to have a split in your brain. One side of your brain is the security that's responsible to put in the means and measures, and the other is privacy, which is to ensure that there's confidentiality, integrity, and that there's control over the data and how the data is being used and by who it's being used. How do you deal with that? Because you have to essentially argue with yourself. And I don't know if you win or lose the argument, but how do you approach that?
I feel like I'm bipolar sometimes, but I'm so up and down, and I argue with myself a lot. But at the end of the day, again, I acknowledge that I'm not going to be the best when it comes to legislations and the nitty-gritty of lawyer speak. So we have legal advisors to help us on that. So I sit with them and I sit with our lawyers and say, cool, exactly what are the key takeaways with the New Zealand Privacy Act or the GDPR, CCPA? What are the things that I need to take into account from a technology perspective and a governance perspective? I think as security folks, we're so easily drawn into the technology side of things, but there's a whole lot more to that. And bringing that and those requirements to the team and saying, right, so these are actually the requirements. Everything else that we think we're doing is actually just extras. Like this is not saying that let's maintain the minimum, but it just means it's having a better understanding of what our legislative responsibilities are, as well as, okay, how can we pragmatically implement this within the business?
There's a good example in PCI DSS, which a lot of you will be familiar with in terms of credit card security, and if you're handling credit card information, the compliance regulations around how that is managed. The most effective PCI DSS strategy is to remove it from scope. So do you need a credit card number in your CRM? No. Do you need it in your data warehouse? No. You need a unique identifier, but it doesn't need to be the credit card number. That's the thing that's at risk. Yeah. So while you can build a whole lot of risk mitigation that assumes that the number's going to be there, but actually the best and most cost-effective strategy is to remove it in the first place. And the same thing, that's where privacy and security are actually complementary, because you can reduce the amount of work you need to do on one side by increasing the amount you do on the other.
Any questions before I go into final comments? Okay, so you have got 2 minutes to make yourself remembered for a year before we come back here again. So closing thoughts, Austin.
Right, I'll go first.
Yeah.
I could probably sum it up a little bit quicker than in 2 minutes. I think I've got this philosophy about IT. We should be closer to the business. So that's one of the things I'd like to share, and like us all to try is to get closer to the business. We're not just in our IT bubble building servers, fixing networks. We need to be able to get closer to the business so they can understand it. The other key thing that I think we should try to do is make it easier, make it simpler for non-technology people to understand. A couple of good examples is like the iPhone is an intuitive technology device. That's a good example. Having like a green padlock and a website is a good way to demonstrate that the SSL certificate is up to date, because people don't understand what good practice is in terms of website security, but they can understand a green padlock. So I think if we can collaborate more and keep it simple, that'd do us all a good service.
Thank you. Ashton?
Yeah, I guess one thing that I don't know has been touched on so much. The question was asked by Peter before around security as an enabler versus security as a disabler. And for me, where I've seen it being an enabler and successful within our customers is actually when security is not an isolated business unit. It's not something that's out by itself, left to its own devices. It's not an us and them. They're actually embedded and working within the organisation at different levels and across the organisation, up and down. And they're not seen as the enemy at that point. They're actually working with and enabling the business to succeed. So that would be one.
Cool. Andrew?
I would say doing the right thing. And Ashton, you just touched on this in terms of what the future of Triple S looks like. It's not necessarily building a model where people are coming back to you to repeat the same services again and again and again, or throwing an acronym out there, and with some of the large consultants, I hope there's no too many large consultants here, but it's true, you invent the terminology comes around again, and And you've got to be a little bit cynical, right? I was around for Y2K. You've got to be cynical when you see this hyper risk and fear component, but then there's a whole lot of services which come at a massive cost that sit right behind it, and it's like, yeah, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that. Now, if we come back to, okay, what's the right thing to do? That inclusivity question is a good one. Are we serving everybody in the community by doing this? That's the right thing to do. Hardly anyone will disagree with that statement. But if we are intent on those sort of outcomes rather than thinking about, okay, where's my next consulting line going to come from, or how am I going to sell this product? And it may be a naive view, but I think if we have that more altruistic and inclusive view, that we're actually all going to be better off. And the work will come, actually. If you are acting with integrity in what you're doing, then you're actually going to get a much better reputation. If you're in for making yourself redundant, so I'm going to sell in some consultancy services and I hope you never see me again. That's a good outcome because you've enabled people to do their job, and so their referral network is going to come straight to you,
True.
that sort of stuff. So I think doing the right thing and keeping that in mind is really my takeaway.
Thank you, Andrew. Micah?
Be a pragmatic pessimist, right? So rather than just, it's in our nature in security. We're always going to see how something probably wasn't done up to the standard that completely mitigates the risk. What does? There's nothing that ever gets mitigated completely. But I think having a pragmatic approach in tackling solutions, in tackling projects, and even just having a conversation with your management. Like Paul mentioned earlier, the board and your executive leadership team, they're only worried about the reds, the oranges, and then the greens. And so for them, they trust you to do the right thing. And I think it's important for us to remember to trust the people in their organization as well, that they are doing the right thing, that they have good intent, and that we don't always have to be right or always have to be the smartest person in the room or to be very dogmatic about things.
True. And so just to sum up from in the last minute, if there's 4 things we can take away, the one is let's have an attitude of pragmatism. Not be pessimistic, but be pragmatic pessimism. The second is that there's this increasing need for collaboration and breaking down the attitude of us versus them. It's the devs versus security. It's the network guys versus the devs. It's everyone against each other. Third thing is we can actually get closer to business. I think that's something that we need to actively try and pursue, get closer to business to get them to understand that it's, that developers are not just people that we close the door and feed pizza under the door and don't talk to them or give them any light. That security guys aren't the guys who always say no. That the CFO isn't the guy who always says, I want to know what my return is. But when we get closer to business, then we all understand what the purpose is. And the final thing that I want to close up on is what Andrew mentioned about, let's just do the right thing. Let's just do the right thing for our customers, for our employees, for Aotearoa New Zealand. If we do the right thing for that, then everything comes together in the way that we rethink our approach to everything. So thank you very much to the panelists for talking to us and engaging us on this topic of rethinking. And thank you. We'll have the next speaker coming up with Georgia. Thank you very much.